They showed up on my doorstep 3 days after Christmas with a fruit basket and matching smiles. I hadn't seen my mother, my brother, or my sister in 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not at birthdays, not at holidays, not when I graduated with my master's degree, not when I bought my first car with my own money. But here they were on December 28th, 2024, standing on the wraparound porch of my Victorian home in Crescent Hills, looking at my address like they'd just discovered Atlantis. My mother, Claudia, spoke first while adjusting her cashmere scarf against the cold. She said, "We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by." Crescent Hills was 40 minutes outside the city center. Nobody was ever just in the neighborhood. My brother, Ethan, stood behind her, hands shoved in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the bay windows and the original stonework I'd spent 6 months restoring. My sister, Bryn, held the fruit basket like it was a golden ticket, her smile so wide it looked painful. I didn't invite them in. I stood in the doorway and let the heat from inside escape into the winter air. 4 years, I said. My mother blinked like I'd spoken in another language. She responded, "Well, you know how time flies. We've all been so busy." Busy, right. Too busy to return a single phone call, too busy to respond to the Christmas cards I sent for 3 straight years before I finally stopped, too busy to acknowledge my existence until someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, told them where I lived now. I asked how they found my address. Bryn finally spoke up, her voice bright and artificial like the spray-on snow people put on their windows. She answered, "Aunt Donna mentioned you'd moved. She said you bought a place. We just wanted to see how you were doing." Aunt Donna, of course. My mother's sister, the only family member who hadn't completely cut me off, though our contact had been minimal at best. She must have driven past my house after I'd finished the exterior renovations 2 months earlier. The house was hard to miss now, perched on a corner lot with the original turret fully restored and painted in historically accurate colors that made people slow down when they drove past. I didn't move aside. Instead, I said I was doing fine and asked if there was something they needed. The masks slipped just a fraction. Ethan shifted his weight. Bryn's smile tightened at the edges. My mother's eyes went cold, and that way they always did when someone didn't follow her script. Claudia stated, "We don't need anything," and noted, "We're family," and explained she thought it was time we reconnected, especially with the new year coming. There it was, the new year. Fresh start, clean slate. All the pretty language people used when they wanted to rewrite history without actually apologizing for it. I could have slammed the door. Part of me wanted to. But a bigger part of me, the part that had spent 4 years building a life they knew nothing about, wanted them to see exactly what they'd missed. So I stepped aside. I said they could come in for a few minutes. They walked past me into the foyer with its refinished hardwood floors and the original chandelier I'd had rewired. I watched them take it in. The crown molding I'd painstakingly repaired. The wallpaper I'd chosen after 3 weeks of research to match the home's 1890s origins. The curved staircase with its carved newel post that I'd stripped and restained by hand. Bryn whispered, "This place is gorgeous." My mother ran her fingers along the hallway table, an antique piece I'd found at an estate sale and restored myself. Claudia remarked that she didn't know I was interested in old houses. She didn't know a lot of things about me. That was the point. I led them into the living room, where the January afternoon light came through the tall windows in golden sheets. I'd furnished it carefully over the past year. Nothing extravagant, but everything chosen with intention. A velvet sofa in deep emerald, bookshelves I'd built into the alcoves flanking the fireplace, plants that actually thrived because I'd finally learned how to care for them properly. Ethan sank into the armchair without being invited and said this must have cost a fortune. I sat across from them and responded that I worked hard for it. Hard work. That was something they'd never associated with me. Growing up, I was the problem child. Not because I got into trouble, but because I didn't fit their mold. My mother wanted daughters who wore the right clothes and dated the right men and chose careers that sounded impressive at dinner parties. She wanted a son who'd take over my father's commercial real estate business when he retired. I wanted to restore old buildings. I wanted to take structures everyone else had given up on and bring them back to life. That made me an embarrassment. When I was 19 and told them I was switching my major from business administration to historic preservation, my father actually laughed. He said I was throwing away my future. My mother cried about what she was supposed to tell her friends. Ethan, who was 24 at the time and already working at the firm, called me selfish for not thinking about the family legacy. Bryn, 21 and engaged to a wealth management analyst, just looked at me with pity. But I did it anyway. I finished my bachelor's degree. I worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for it because my parents cut me off financially the day I changed my major. I graduated with honors. Then I got into a competitive master's program for architectural conservation. That's when the ghosting really started. I'd call home and get sent to voicemail. I'd text and get one-word responses if I got anything at all. I'd show up for Thanksgiving and find out they'd changed the date without telling me. Christmas became an obligation they clearly resented. By the time I finished my master's program, I'd stopped existing to them in any meaningful way. The last time I'd seen them before today was at my grandmother's funeral in August 4 years earlier. I was 26, 6 months into my first real job with a restoration firm in the city. My mother looked through me like I was a stranger. Ethan talked business with cousins and never once acknowledged I was there. Bryn spent the entire reception showing off her toddler and planning her second wedding because the first one hadn't worked out. I left before the reception ended. Nobody noticed. Now they sat in my living room, the room I'd plastered and painted myself, and pretended 4 years of silence was just an oversight.
Claudia set her purse down and mentioned this place must require a lot of upkeep. I agreed it did and added that I enjoyed it. Bryn leaned forward with that concerned sister expression she'd perfected and asked if I was managing okay financially, noting these old houses can be money pits. I told her I was managing just fine. The truth was better than fine. I was 30 years old and I owned this house outright. No mortgage, no debt. I'd saved every dollar I could from my job at the restoration firm, lived in a studio apartment that cost next to nothing, drove a car held together by duct tape and prayer, and spent 5 years building my skills and my reputation. Then, 18 months ago, I'd taken a risk. I left the firm and started my own consultation business, specializing in Victorian-era restoration. I was good at it, really good. Within 6 months, I had more clients than I could handle. Within a year, I'd made enough to buy this house when it came on the market, a foreclosure that every other buyer had passed on because of its condition. I spent 8 months bringing it back to life. I did most of the work myself. The things I couldn't do, I hired specialists I'd met through years in the field. People who respected craftsmanship, people who understood that some things were worth saving. If you're watching this and you've ever felt invisible to the people who were supposed to see you, leave a comment. I want to hear your story. Ethan cleared his throat and said he'd actually been meaning to reach out because he'd heard I was doing some kind of consulting work. I confirmed I was and specified restoration consulting. He nodded slowly and mentioned they'd been talking, as a family, about possibly investing in some properties and wondered if I might have insights on older buildings, since that was apparently my thing now. My thing, like it was a hobby, like I hadn't spent a decade training and building expertise while they pretended I didn't exist. I asked what kind of properties. Claudia jumped in and explained they were looking at a development opportunity and stated some of the buildings were historic, noting they needed someone who understood that world and realized I might be able to help. There it was. They didn't want to reconnect. They wanted free expertise. They wanted access to my professional network. They wanted to profit from the skills they'd mocked me for developing. I asked when this investment opportunity came up. Bryn glanced at Ethan before responding that they'd been exploring options for a few months. A few months. Right around when Aunt Donna would have seen my house and mentioned it to my mother. Right around when someone could have Googled my name and found my business website, the one with testimonials from satisfied clients and photos of my completed projects. I stood up and said I'd think about it, noting I was actually pretty busy with current projects, but I'd let them know. They stood too, exchanging those quick looks families share when their plan isn't going the way they expected. My mother suggested we should have dinner soon, maybe New Year's Eve, and noted it would be nice to catch up properly.
I walked them to the door. They filed out onto the porch with their fruit basket that I hadn't touched. The winter sun was starting to set, turning the sky over Crescent Hills into layers of orange and pink. Claudia turned back and said it really was good to see me, adding she hoped I'd seriously consider helping with the project. I told her I'd be in touch, and closed the door before she could say anything else. I stood in my foyer, in the house I built with my own hands and my own money, and felt that familiar tightness in my chest that always came with my family. But this time, something was different. This time, I had proof that I'd been right, that choosing myself over their approval had been worth it, that the 4 years of silence had hurt, but they'd also freed me to become someone they never thought I could be. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Aunt Donna's name. We hadn't spoken in months, but I needed to know exactly what she'd told them and when. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise. She said hello and noted she wasn't expecting to hear from me. I asked if she'd told my mother about my house. There was a pause, just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. Donna admitted she might have mentioned it when Claudia called last month. I asked what else she'd mentioned. Another pause. She confessed she may have said I was doing very well with my business and explained Claudia seemed genuinely interested in reconnecting. Genuinely interested. Right. I thanked her for her honesty and told her I needed to go. She started to say something about family being important, but I ended the call. The thing about being ghosted by your family is that you eventually build a new life in the silence. You find out who you are when nobody's telling you who you should be. You discover that their absence, as much as it hurts, creates space for you to grow in directions they never would have allowed. But then they come back, and you have to decide what that means. I walked through my house as the last light faded from the windows. Every room told a story of those 4 years. The dining room where I'd learned to use a plaster float. The kitchen where I'd installed subway tiles at midnight because I couldn't sleep. The second-floor bathroom where I'd salvaged the original clawfoot tub from a demolition site and spent 2 weeks stripping away decades of paint. They thought they could walk back into my life because I had something they wanted. They thought 4 years of silence could be erased with a fruit basket and vague mentions of investment opportunities. They had no idea what was coming, because in 3 days, on New Year's Eve, I was hosting a party, a real one, with the clients who'd trusted me, the contractors who'd worked beside me, the friends I'd made in the years they'd ignored me, people who'd seen me build this life from nothing. And my family, with their sudden interest in reconnecting, was about to see exactly who I'd become without them. The invitation arrived in my mother's inbox 2 days later. I sent it myself, a professionally designed email with photos of my house lit up for the holidays. New Year's Eve celebration at my home in Crescent Hills. Cocktails at 7, dinner at 8. A night to remember as we welcome the new year. I copied Ethan and Bryn. I even copied Aunt Donna, though I added a personal note to hers explaining that I hoped she'd come and that there were no hard feelings about what she'd told my mother. Claudia responded within an hour, saying they'd love to attend and asking if they could bring anything. I told her, just themselves. The next 2 days I spent preparing, not just the house, though I did make sure everything was perfect. I spent those days making phone calls, confirming details, making sure certain people would be there, making sure others knew exactly what to expect. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, everything was in place. My guests started showing up around 7:15. Nadia, the contractor who'd helped me restore the turret, arrived first with her wife. Then came James and Colette, a couple who'd hired me to save their Queen Anne from demolition 6 months earlier. Marcus Dalton showed up with a bottle of expensive wine and stories about the row houses we were working on downtown. Yes, his last name was Dalton. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. By 7:30, my living room was full of people who actually knew me, who'd seen me covered in plaster dust and paint, who understood why saving a piece of architectural history mattered, who'd celebrated with me when I bought this house and never once questioned whether I could handle it. My family arrived at exactly 8. Claudia walked in wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first car, her eyes scanning the crowd with that practiced smile she used at charity events. Ethan wore a suit that screamed money. Bryn had done something elaborate with her hair and kept touching it like she was afraid it would fall apart. They looked so out of place among my guests, in their casual clothes and genuine laughter. I greeted them at the door and took their coats. My mother kissed my cheek, the kind of air kiss that didn't actually make contact. She whispered that the house looked even more beautiful with people in it, and said I'd done such a lovely job. I thanked her and offered to introduce them around. That's when Aunt Donna appeared from the dining room, her face already flushed from the wine. She rushed over and hugged me tightly, smelling like expensive perfume and guilt. She said quietly that she was so glad I'd invited her, and added she really was sorry about mentioning things to Claudia. I hugged her back and told her it was fine, that everything worked out exactly the way it needed to. She didn't understand what I meant yet. None of them did. I guided my family through the rooms, introducing them to my guests. Nadia talked about the structural challenges we'd faced with the turret. James described how I'd convinced the Historical Society to approve his renovation plans when 3 other consultants had failed. A woman named Iris, who ran a salvage company I worked with, told a story about how I'd identified original stained glass hidden behind drywall in a condemned building. My mother smiled through all of it, but I could see her confusion growing. This wasn't what she expected. She thought she'd find me playing house, pretending to have a career. Instead, she found professionals who respected me, who sought my expertise, who paid me very well for it. Around 8:45, I asked everyone to gather in the dining room. I'd set up a long table with food catered from a local restaurant I loved. Nothing fancy, but everything delicious. 22 people crowded around it, filling the room with warmth and noise. I stood at the head of the table and tapped my glass. The conversations died down. Everyone looked at me expectantly. I said I wanted to thank them all for coming and for being part of my life, especially over the past few years. I noted that some of them had been with me from the beginning of my business, and others I'd met more recently, but all of them had supported me in ways that meant more than they probably realized. Nadia raised her glass and called out that I was too humble, saying I was the one who'd supported all of them with my brilliant ideas and dedication. People laughed and agreed. Someone said I'd saved their project from disaster. Someone else mentioned how I always answered my phone, even at weird hours when they had questions. My mother's face was doing something interesting. Pride, mixed with confusion, mixed with something that looked almost like jealousy. I continued and said there was something specific I wanted to share tonight, especially with the new year starting tomorrow. I stated it was about family and what that word really means. The room went quiet. People sensed something coming. I looked directly at Claudia and said that 4 years ago, my family decided I wasn't worth their time because I chose a career they didn't respect. I explained they stopped calling and responding to messages, noting they made it clear that unless I lived my life according to their plan, I didn't exist to them. Ethan started to say something, but I held up my hand. I went on and mentioned they showed up at my door 3 days ago, after 4 years of silence, adding it wasn't because they missed me or felt bad about cutting me off. I revealed they came because they found out I was successful, and they thought they could use my expertise and connections for a real estate investment they were planning. Bryn's face went red. Aunt Donna stared at her wineglass. My mother's expression turned to ice. Claudia stated firmly that that wasn't fair and claimed we genuinely wanted to reconnect. I smiled at her and said, "That's funny, because I actually looked into their investment opportunity. I mentioned I made some calls and discovered exactly what they were planning. I pulled out my phone and brought up the documents I'd saved. I explained they'd put together an investment group to buy a historic block in the warehouse district, noting there were 6 buildings on that block, all listed on the historical register. Ethan demanded to know how I knew that, saying those were private discussions. I replied that the architectural community was smaller than he thought, especially when it came to historic properties. I added that when someone starts sniffing around protected buildings, word gets around quickly. I continued and stated their plan was to buy the buildings cheap, gut them despite their protected status, and convert them into luxury condos. I revealed they'd already lined up a developer who had a history of skirting preservation laws and paying minimal fines when caught. The room was as quiet as a graveyard now. My guests looked shocked. My family looked trapped. I said the kicker was that they needed my consultation to make it look legitimate. If they could claim they'd worked with a respected preservation consultant, someone with my credentials and relationships with the Historical Society, they could get away with destroying those buildings before anyone stopped them. My mother's voice came out sharp when she insisted we were going to preserve the important features. I laughed, an actual laugh that came from somewhere deep in my chest. I responded that no, they weren't, noting I'd seen the developer's previous projects. I explained he'd destroyed a perfectly intact Art Deco building in Riverside 2 years ago by claiming the renovations were too expensive, adding he'd paid the $12,000 fine and made $3 million in profit. I looked around at my guests and said that these people in this room, they're my real family. I noted they showed up when I needed help and celebrated when I succeeded, adding they never asked me to be anything other than who I am. If you've ever had to choose between people who share your blood and people who actually see your worth, drop a comment below. You're not alone in that struggle. Colette stood up and said she wanted to add something. She explained that I'd worked on her house for 8 months and could have cut corners a dozen times to make more money, but I never did because I cared about doing it right. James added that I'd turned down a project last year because the client wanted me to hide structural damage instead of fixing it properly. He said, "That's integrity." Marcus Dalton, because, of course, someone named Dalton had to deliver the final blow, mentioned that the warehouse district project had actually come across his desk 3 weeks ago. He revealed his firm represented the Historical Society in preservation matters. He stated that when he saw the investor group's names and their developer of choice, he flagged it immediately as suspicious. He looked at my mother and said the Historical Society would be voting next week on whether to pursue an injunction against any sale or development of those properties pending a full review. My mother's face went from ice to stone. Ethan looked like he might be sick. Bryn had tears in her eyes, though whether from anger or shame I couldn't tell. Claudia stated very quietly that I'd set them up. I corrected her and said no, they'd set themselves up. I explained I just made sure the right people knew what they were planning before they could destroy something that didn't belong to them. Aunt Donna, to her credit, set down her wineglass and said she thought maybe they should leave. My mother turned on her and snapped that this was Donna's fault for telling me about their plans. But Donna shook her head and replied that she'd told me about the house, not about their scheme. She added that she'd had no idea what they were really after until right now. She looked at me and said she was sorry, truly sorry for not seeing what kind of people her own sister had become. My mother grabbed her purse and announced they were leaving. She stated that I'd embarrassed them in front of strangers and ruined what could have been a profitable opportunity for the whole family. I said these weren't strangers, and they were my family, the one I chose. Ethan followed our mother toward the door, but Bryn hesitated. She looked at me with something that might have been regret. She said softly that the house really was beautiful. I told her thank you, and that I built it without them. She flinched like I'd slapped her, then followed Ethan out. Aunt Donna stayed. She helped me clear the dishes after everyone else had gone back to celebrating. Around 11:30, when we were alone in the kitchen, she asked why I'd invited them if I knew what they were planning. I explained that for 4 years I thought maybe I was the problem, that maybe I deserved the silence because I disappointed them. I noted that I needed them to show me, in front of people who actually cared about me, exactly who they were. She asked if I felt better now. I thought about it while drying a wine glass, one from a set I'd bought myself to celebrate my first big contract. I answered that I felt free. We went back to the living room where my real family was counting down to midnight. Nadia had pulled up the ball drop on her phone. People were pouring champagne into mismatched glasses I'd collected from estate sales. At midnight, we screamed and hugged and toasted to new beginnings, to buildings saved from demolition, to careers built on passion instead of approval, to families we choose instead of families we're born into. My phone buzzed around 20 past midnight, a text from my mother stating that I'd regret this and noting she hoped I was happy with my choice. I deleted it without responding. Around 2 in the morning, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, I walked through the rooms turning off lights. I stopped in the foyer, the same spot where my family had stood 3 days earlier pretending they cared. The grandfather clock in the hallway, the one I'd found buried under garbage in the basement and spent 2 months restoring, chimed twice. I'd spent 4 years being invisible, 4 years wondering if I'd made the wrong choice, 4 years building something real while they pretended I didn't exist. But standing in my house, the house they'd tried to use me to betray everything I believed in, I finally understood something important. They didn't ghost me because I disappointed them. They ghosted me because I refused to be who they wanted. And the moment they thought I could be useful again, they came back with smiles and fruit baskets and plans that would have destroyed the very things I'd dedicated my life to protecting. I'd spent 4 years becoming someone they could never use, someone who knew her worth, someone who'd built a family that didn't need blood to be real. The new year had started. My real family was gone. My real family was scattered across the city, probably still laughing about the look on my mother's face when Marcus mentioned the injunction. And I was standing in a house I'd saved from destruction, just like I'd saved myself. I turned off the last light and climbed the stairs to bed. Tomorrow, I'd start the year the way I'd spent the last 4, on my own terms, with people who chose to be in my life instead of people who thought they owned it. They ghosted me until they saw my house, but what they never understood was that the house was just wood and stone and glass. The real thing they couldn't touch, couldn't use, couldn't destroy, was the person I'd become in their absence.